The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Smiling Human podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Kiki Grace and Jason Goode. These two are somatic coaches helping growth seekers create thriving, authentic relationships. Using the wheel of consent, somatic experiencing, and transformational coaching, they guide clients to build connection through self-responsibility, clear agreements, and nervous system regulation. With expertise in somatic sex education, addiction recovery, yoga, sports performance, and psychedelic facilitation, they empower individuals and couples to break free from disconnection, to embody authenticity, and foster deeply fulfilling relationships. Through quizzes, courses, and personalized programs, these two help clients cultivate intimacy and to live in alignment. It was a beautifully flowing conversation that the three of us had today that touches on their hidden relationship patterns quiz, which I had the privilege of taking and learning a little bit about myself in so doing. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Fantastic. Well, friends, Jason, welcome to the show. Kiki, welcome back. This is going to be a beautiful show. No doubt we're already smiling and laughing, having gone through a few hoops to get here today. One thing I want to let the audience know, obviously they would have heard a bit about both of you in the intro, but what they did not necessarily know is that I had the pleasure and privilege of taking your hidden relationship patterns quiz, and that all of us have my very interesting results. And that's going to be the foundation of today's episode. We're going to be exploring some of these hidden relationship patterns, how each can impact us inside of our relationships, as well as a bit of the history on how you guys got here. So to start the show, I'll ask you both the question I ask all guests at the head. What is the last thing that made you smile?
Well, the last thing that made me smile was us setting up today was quite fun. And we were messing around with the lights. We couldn't quite get it right. And I like to make fun of Kiki and her technology knowledge deficits. And so I just leaned fully into that.
Thank you so much. I am smiling now, but yeah, it's funny. Both times I've been on your podcast, we have tech issues. It's just a thing that likes to happen. And I have some tech savviness. Thank you. Just not
she
not
totally
in all
does.
things.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes. Starting off smiling as always.
Beautiful. Well, let's give a bit of a runway for the audience here as it relates to the hidden relationship patterns quiz and soma relating. I find myself in this present moment most curious as to the seed. Why hidden relationship patterns? Why these particular modalities? What is it that you were hoping to bring to light and support by bringing this work out into the world?
Well, in both of our work, the clients that we work with, whether myself as a somatic sex educator or Kiki with her coaching and guiding, we just kept noticing the same thing, which is that people were not asking for what they wanted. And they were using all of these other strategies to try to get what they wanted. And it was causing a lot of suffering in their relationships. And it just was over and over and over again. At the same time, we had developed this workshop where we were giving a framework of how to create conscious agreements and how to not take responsibility for other people's domains or their feelings or their reactions to what you want. And we were just looking for some more tools to communicate to people that they're not asking for what they want and they're using these other tactics instead. And it was funny, we came up with this idea, okay, let's create some easy entry point for people to start to think about this. And we were, okay, so what are the different strategies that people use? And it, like, almost immediately we had them all because we've seen it over and over and over again with clients.
And I would say, as we were like uncovering the different types, I was actually able to recognize, like in my own evolution, how I engaged in relationships in my 20s versus how I engage now as I've learned how to better regulate myself, how to communicate better, how to create conscious agreements. As I've done all this learning for myself and I'm coaching people how to do it, I was actually able to recognize, like, oh, in that relationship, I definitely was using that strategy a lot more. And some of that is the dynamic of the other person and what they brought out in me, or vice versa. But I was actually able to recognize too the parts of myself that were online and that I needed to work through at different stages of my own development.
Right. So there's a sense, and perhaps one that brings hope, that when someone goes through this quiz and starts to become more aware of the different strategies and maybe the less advantageous ones that they apply, that there is in fact room for growth throughout all of this. One piece I'd like you to expand on, either of you, is the idea of domains. I know you included that in the explanation, but I'm not sure that the audience has a clear understanding of what that means for them and how that relates to getting to the point of asking clearly for what we want inside of a relationship. Can we expand on that?
Yeah. So we use the word domain to describe me as my own individual person. I'm doing a circle here for people who are just listening. So if you can envision a circle as an individual person, myself, which encompasses everything that I am responsible for and have a right to. So this is my body, my thoughts, my feelings, my desires, my reactions, my communication, my actions. I don't know if I said that. Are there any other ones I'm kind of missing? Dreams, ambitions, all of these things, they're all in my domain, my purview of me and an individual. That, again, the main key is I have a right and a responsibility for. And no one else has a right or a responsibility to get those for me, to help me get them. Nobody. It's just mine within my circle, within my domain. And my boundary is the spot, the line around the circle that keeps that as mine and not somebody else's. Am I missing something, Jay?
No, it's just that idea of instead of using terms like boundaries, which can get a little slippery, just understanding what you're responsible for, what you have a right to, and what you're not responsible for and don't have a right to when it comes to other people. Codependency enmeshment happens when our domains start to overlap and we start taking on responsibility for things that are in the other person's domain, their feelings, their reactions, their desires, instead of being two separate conscious individuals who come together to create a relationship, agreements, or whatever it might be. We think of ourselves as domains and we're separate. And that actually gives us the freedom to authentically connect with another person because we're maintaining our status as separate individuals.
Hmm. This reminds me in part of the work of Alfred Adler when he speaks about the distance necessary for healthy relationships. I've been reading the book The Courage to Be Disliked recently, and that's based off of Adler's work. And when you're describing domains, there's sort of a crossover terminology with tasks from the Adlerian perspective, which is to say that whatever it is we have a responsibility to fulfill is our task. And that in some essence, what I'm hearing and what I have experienced personally, and I'm sure many listeners have as well, is that whenever someone else is attempting to take one of our tasks from us or without permission, or if we neglect to fulfill our tasks and want somebody else to do it consciously or unconsciously, this is where that sort of slippery slope into codependency and enmeshment begins. And this might be a good transition point to talk about that differentiation and what happens when codependency and enmeshment happens. Because as I've been reading through my results, the smuggler, the desire smuggler, is one of these categories here. And I think we should maybe go over the different strategies. And I would love to, expand a bit more on how they play out in terms of domains?
Yeah, so we have these descriptions, these strategies that we describe in the quiz of the different ways in which we essentially avoid taking responsibility for our domain and using your language. Oh, part of one of our tasks as a individual is to be responsible for what we want and to be able to communicate that clearly. So instead of doing that task, we try to find a backdoor way to get what we want instead of actually asking directly. So one of these strategies we call the desire smuggler. Now, that wasn't actually a term we came up with. Some other practitioners came up with that term, but we found it very powerful and we've used that in ours as well. And so this is, instead of communicating directly what we want, which for that person is often just a little too scary, we we try to get the other person to want the same thing. So, if you've seen the movie Inception, it's almost like you're incepting that desire into that person. So instead of asking for it, they'll want it. So, a very simple, everyday example is I'm thirsty, hoping that your person, your partner, whoever, family member will get the drink for you. You're kind of smuggling that thing into them so that they will go get the drink. You haven't actually asked for anything. You're sort of smuggling that desire. Or you might try to get them to want that thing, whatever that is that you want. Kiki, do you want to expand on that?
Um, I mean, I think some of the subtle, not so subtle ways that desire smuggling shows up is, as we've identified, is like passive aggressiveness is actually a desire smuggle. Um, and other kind of emotional manipulation things can be a desire smuggle where you're like half naming something you feel or want, but there's no actual request in it. So you're ultimately actually naming an experience. I'm thirsty. You're naming an experience you're having, but you're not asking for what you want fulfilled to either alleviate, change, or do something about the experience that you're having. So like I'm thirsty or I'm cold. Would you get me a glass of water? That becomes a request that's a little bit more direct. Or would you pass me that blanket? And these might seem like inconsequential, but when we struggle with these like really in quote unquote kind of inconsequential things, bigger things become even harder to ask for. Will you take me out for dinner on Saturday night to my favorite restaurant? Like, if we can't ask for a blanket to be passed to us, am I actually going to be asked to go out on a date to the place I want? That's like bigger and more vulnerable. Desire smuggling shows up in so many different ways. Um,
Even like if
and
you were to say, would you like to go to the movies? Right? You're again trying to initiate that you're the one that actually wants to go out and go to the movies, but you're trying to initiate it so that the other person is like, yeah, let's go to the movies. I'd like to go to the movies. And again, it's just a small, inconsequential event. But if we're not practicing with the easy stuff, the hard stuff gets really difficult.
yeah. And the change for that is I want to see a movie. Do you want to come with me? And it's very different as to who's actually owning the desire to go out. Do you want to go? I don't know. Do you want to go? Like, what are we doing here?
Right, right. So the danger or the harm that follows from this particular strategy, insofar as I see it, and you let me know how this lands and what you think of it, is that there's intrinsic to it a lack of activation and ownership over what exactly is felt by the individual, which is saying, hey, this is what's real for me. And because that's not being owned, perhaps consciously, and not being expressed explicitly, then the space between the two people who are involved is now of a lower resolution. I really like to use that metaphor. It's not exactly clear what's being said. And in some sense as well, there's the expectation that the other will do a degree of mental labor to interpret what is being said.
Exactly.
And when we start to impress upon other people unconsensual emotional labor, you can bet you're behind that resentment and bitterness and frustration is going to follow. Am I close to the mark here?
Totally. I mean, I think all of the strategies have elements of that, not just the desire smuggle, but they are places where we leave opportunity for guesswork for the other people to try to like figure it out. Or some of the other strategies, like the needs to feel justified, has to have all these reasons why they're allowed to ask for something instead of just asking for something. And maybe in a moment we'll go through all the different strategies, but they all have a degree of putting aspects of our domain, what's our responsibility and right to own, onto somebody else to figure out for us, so that I can get my needs met by someone else doing more of the labor, more of the work.
And you mentioned resentment. A moment like that, it's quite, if you think of it like, it's quite a swing, a lost opportunity in building intimacy and authenticity. So there was a moment there where you could say, I would really like to do this thing with you, and reveal part of yourself and invite someone to meet you there. That has now not only, you've lost that opportunity, but you've not done that, but now you've also created this situation where instead of building some intimacy and closeness between your two separate domains, you've now brought on the opportunity for resentment. If that person is not able to pick up what you're saying and do it for you, now you actually may push each other further apart.
Right. Which is obviously not what we're going for. So let's expand the understanding here and introduce the audience to some of the other strategies. We obviously have talked on desire smuggling, but maybe Jason, you can walk us through what they are, and maybe then we can also open up into my results and to see how they shape up, and maybe some real world examples.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll unpack this as we go, but just as a foundation, so much of these strategies are essentially a way of avoiding someone saying no directly to you, right? It's not just revealing what you actually want and the intimacy that requires. It's also a fear of rejection, of someone responding to your direct reveal of who you are and what you want with a no. So one of the other strategies that we've named is a guess right or else strategy. So in this case, a person has standards of what they believe they deserve or they want or they need, and that these standards should be obvious and they're clearly the best and proper way to do something. Um, and so they tend to um, mistaken their preferences for a kind of morality, and they assume that a good person or the person who's the right fit for them should just know what they want or what they need. And if their partner doesn't intuitively understand that, um, some people will just end that relationship, and they'll cycle through relationships where that person that they're in relationship with is not meeting them the way that they think is obvious and everyone should understand, but they've never actually stated what they want or need. And they don't realize that everyone's a little different, and people might not have the same needs or wants or be able to pick up on what you want or need. Um, did you want me to go to the next one, or did you want to unpack that one a
Yeah,
little
let's
bit?
do just an overview, and then we'll go one by one.
Great. So the next one that we identified is the needs to be justified strategy. So in this case, someone's wants or desires are not enough on their own. They don't sort of stand as valuable just on their own. That person needs to qualify why they deserve that thing. And so they'll often list all the reasons why they should have this thing, or they might list all the reasons why this other person has fallen short and should just get them this thing. So they're not able to just be like, hey, I'm feeling tired, would you mind taking the kids tonight? It might come out as, um, I took them out last week, I did X, Y, and Z, you take the kids tonight, I need you to
And
take
you
the kids
haven't
tonight.
done X, Y, and Z for the last
Right.
while, therefore
Yeah.
you owe me. There's also
Yeah.
sometimes an element of guilt. The other person's falling short already, therefore they ought to stand up and do the thing.
So this person is unable to honor their wants and needs for their own sake. They don't see it as being able to stand on their own. They need to add these qualifiers or indicate that that other person is in their debt. So right, they're always why they deserve to have this want or need met instead of just asking for it. Another one, which is really common, we call the hope for the best strategy. And this is someone who can't ever ask for what they want. To ask for that would threaten the relationship. And so they are in a perpetual state of hoping that eventually they're going to get what they want. And sometimes they'll do sort of like covert trades where they're going to do something for this person in hope that that other person will see it and give them what they want. It's not always conscious. Sometimes it's unconscious, but they'll often, help someone out and do the dishes or do something for their partner or a friend. And they're hoping that that partner will return the favor instead of just, again, asking for what they want. So in some of the men's work that I've done in interacting with other men, this is one is quite common, especially for the quote unquote like good man who's trying to do right by their family and their partner. And they'll often just over time lose touch with what they actually want and never actually name it. They're just sort of in perpetual service. And I'm sure I know this isn't gendered and women have their own version of it. It's just something I'm really sensitive to recently with some of the men that I've worked with. Another strategy we identified is the outburst demand strategy. And this is often can come after one of the other strategies have been employed for a long time and resentment has built up. Excuse me. So this is the kind of strategy, the kind of person who requires a certain level of activation and frustration to finally ask for the thing. So when the need comes up, they don't just ask for it. They might employ other strategies. And then eventually it reaches this sort of boiling point. And it might come out as like yelling or it might just be like that intense frustration, but that person needs a boiling point essentially to finally actually ask for the thing that they want. So especially guess right or else is often tied to the outburst demand strategy, but every strategy can eventually reach this point as well. And then finally, the one that we're encouraging people to move towards. So you'll see it in the quiz and in the scoring, and then in some of the materials we make available after that, is being vulnerable and open. So this is someone who is responsible for their own domain, what they have a responsibility for and a right to. They recognize that the people close to them and other people have their own domain, and they're able to ask for what they want, being hoping for a yes, but being open for a no. And even when that no is disappointing, to be able to be responsible for your own feelings around that. And also not avoiding for what asking for what you want by taking responsibility for someone else's feelings and how they might react to it, but being your own domain and a little more direct in what you ask for.
Brilliant. Thank you for that overview. So to reiterate, we have the one that we're directing people towards that is being encouraged through the work and the education that you are bringing into the world is being vulnerable and open. We have guess right or else, which is that sort of standard, the moralistic element that comes in. The desire smuggler, which is an attempt to manipulate the other into wanting what we want so that we can have it without asking. The needs to be justified swings in two directions. Either the impression I got is that there's a sense of unworthiness unless there's a really, really good reason or a long list of reasons for me to have what I want, or the guilt and manipulation aspect of, hey, I've done all these things, you need to give me what I want. And then the hope for the best, which is the silent sufferer, I might call, which is just going, let's see if it happens eventually. So how did I do for the overview? Is that
was
accurate?
A great,
and
that's a
then
great
the
overview.
Outburst demand. And the outburst demand. Yeah.
Outburst demand, which is exactly as it sounds, an outburst in the demand.
As it sounds. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so I'm glad to report that my primary strategy is vulnerable and open. I was very happy to see that. The other two, which were most high, was desire smuggling and guess right or else. And now selfishly justifying why that might be, while I was answering the quiz, I was thinking back to my last relationship, which is nearly a year. I'm a year out of that, and was by no hyperbolic statement the most difficult relationship I'd ever been in. And I'd love to speak just a bit to my experience of this and offer the audience some insights on how this might show up for them. Starting with the guess right or else, when you brought up the idea that it's this moralistic perspective, that there's kind of an obvious set of rules on how people should be treating one another, I felt a bit called out in that, because one of the pieces that I've noticed in myself as kind of a struggle is, being that I have dedicated so much of my life towards uncovering truth and wisdom and the practical embodiment of that for the benefit of myself, my growth, and the growth of clients and community, it seems bloody obvious to me how we should care for people. It's like, this is what feels like love. This is what promotes growth. This is how we speak truthfully. All of these things now, after 2 decades, seems obvious. And so when I found myself answering these questions, I was reminded of a very sobering experience that I had, which was when I was not met with that, when I was met with something so very counter to that, something that might be perceived as intentionally harmful. I was confused. I was literally confused, because what happened there is that I was confronted with the fact that my standards, as we've called them, were not universally held. They weren't as obvious as I had once considered. Therefore, the point that you made, that we have a responsibility to articulate the specificities of how we want to be related with, became, well, paramount in that moment. I had to go, hold on. This is okay, this isn't okay. Here's the groupings of what's acceptable and unacceptable. And that's a labor that most people aren't confronted with unless they find themselves inside of a relationship with someone who is consistently acting contrary to what they believe they deserve, they want, or how they ought to be treated. That's been my experience. Kiki?
I think there's some truth in that, but I also think a lot of us in our 20s, as we're developing relationships, as we're learning what it means to relate, like you said, after 2 decades, like now you're like, there's a certain way that we should do that. But if someone hasn't ever studied this literature, if someone hasn't ever done anything, their relationships are based on their family, what was taught to them as the way of being in the world. Like we're going to repeat what has been shown and taught to us as the way to do it. And so I don't necessarily think it only shows up when someone is maybe kind of very counter to us. I think we all have certain standards and ways that I want that aren't necessarily super hierarchical, but it's just like, I like being held in a certain way, and maybe my partner likes being held in a completely different way. And if we just assumed that my way was right and his way was wrong, if I assume that, or vice versa, we're never going to align. And when I can say, hey, this is how I want to be held when we're cuddling, would you do that for me? And how do you want to be? Like, it's just a preference. And so like, that's the thing with the guess right or else, is it's moralizing your preference. Your preference is inherently right. Therefore it should be obvious. Therefore I shouldn't have to ask for it, instead of recognizing it as merely a preference. And while there are, like, obviously we are advocates for being vulnerable and open as a way of creating more harmonious relationships, it isn't necessarily the only way. People could still choose to relate a different way if they want to, right? Like, that is their choice. Being clear in how you're relating, I think, is the biggest thing that we really advocate for, is at least just being open, and this is how I want to do this thing with you.
Yeah, I might add too that your certainty that you have right now around how this is supposed to work, there's, a significant percentage of that which years from now you'll realize is just wrong. You don't know what that is yet, But that is going to happen because it happens to all of us. We are so certain about how this should be. And then just through experience and failure and trial and error and experimentation, we realize that we were just wrong. And there's lots of different ways to be that are all equally as good or beneficial. And so having some humility around how we think things should be, and then being very diligent about communicating that early in a relationship. So the way you described it, I would go back at you and be like, it's important then that you learn to communicate early. If this is happening late and you're realizing this late in a relationship or after some time, that's on you for not communicating that early and being open and vulnerable and not making any assumptions. So we want to like take that responsibility into our own domain and be clear right from the get-go when we're starting relationships how this works for us, what we're looking for, and when things aren't quite connecting or vibing in the way we want, being curious about that other person and some of their assumptions, and owning as early as possible what our expectations are of how this works. So we need to constantly turn this back on ourselves and invite humility and recognizing I might be wrong. And it's my responsibility to tell that other person this is not okay, or this is what I want.
Mm-hmm. I would offer the clarity that when we talk about this is wrong, it's rooted down obviously into the body, right? When I think about the moralistic projections and all these different pieces, one of the things that really stands out to me through the learning that I went through in developing the kind of awareness that I just spoke to is something I want to add directly to what you said about the humility and the maturation of the perspective, which is to say that in the moment, if something feels quote unquote wrong, there's multiple things that are actually taking place, right? There's the action that's being received by the other person or the communication that is being received by the other person. There's how that's interpreted and how the body responds to it. And then there's also how your own mind is responding to how your body is reacting. All of those are features that then get unilaterally reduced into this idea of wrongness. And one of the pieces that I think is really powerful for people to realize, when I realized it, I was like, oh my God, the world's so open, is that when we start to parse these apart, pathways to intimacy, to pleasure, to communication, to authentically being seen, respected, held, all of these rich golden nuggets that we yearn for inside of relationships, there's a ton of different paths. It doesn't have to be anti to what feels wrong. It might be, right? But it could look like something you can't even imagine until you're willing to bear forward the reality of the pain you're experiencing in that particular moment or fear. And I think that that's really the bridge that you guys are speaking to. And I love that so much because vulnerability, authenticity, intimacy all rest on the foundation of truth. We have to be real in order to connect. We have to be real in order to receive. And everybody's real looks different. And I think that's where that variation comes forth.
And one quick thing I want to potentially offer again, it's like a vocabulary change or just a different way of understanding like wrongness, is it can also be that doesn't work for me. You aren't inherently wrong for wanting that. There is nothing wrong in that desire that you have. And it's not workable for me here, or it's not workable in this way. Could we negotiate and find a way to make it workable? And like that takes us on a different thing, but it's wrong and right is kind of this false binary that it's like here or here. And I want to really articulate like some of what we really advocate for as well is like widen your ability to understand what's workable for you and unworkable, and in relationships trying to find mutual workability where both parties are getting needs and wants met because they're owning them and speaking to them and negotiating them is available when we're vulnerable and open and when we communicate. But it's not necessarily inherently anything is wrong or right. It's workable or unworkable or for me or not for me. And sometimes that also discharges this, that's wrong, versus, oh, I'm just not available for that. That's not for me.
And functionally gets us to the same point
Mm-hmm.
through a healthier
Mm-hmm.
way. If we're going to condemn someone from a moralistic point of view, we do so as a rejection and an attempt to distance ourselves from that experience. But if you say, remove that, and like you're saying, just go, hey, you know what? For me, not for me. I'm not really a big fan of flan. You keep the flan over there. I'll stick with my cheesecake, keep that distance and that differentiation. Honoring the differentiation is key. One thing that I'd be curious to hear what either and or both of you have to say is that in response to this, what I noticed while I was going through the quiz and answering some of these questions is that, yes, in some sense, my coping strategies that don't fall inside this vulnerable and open approach root down into the communication styles that I was raised with. I get that. I also noticed that given the intensity of the dynamic that I was most recently in, some of them developed as a means of putting the fires out. So it's like there was sort of a testing strategy, and I wonder about how all of this plugs into that. It's like, are there moments where this might be a softball question or right out of the field, but are there moments where some of these are safer than others? Because that's how it felt for me.
Yeah,
Vulnerable didn't feel safe.
I
Please.
think that's the right question to ask. So when we work with people, we talk about how a large portion of what we're doing is rewiring their bodies essentially for a relationship. And in part, that's because all of these strategies are employed because for whatever reason, your body doesn't feel safe just asking for what you want. And if your desire is to shift to be more vulnerable and open, when we're working with people and in the material we send for, even from this quiz, we actually say, be careful. Not everyone is going to receive this. And it might be true that the people in your life don't want you to directly ask. And that strategy that you employed was the wise one. And your body was smart to do that consciously or unconsciously. So there is some care that's needed as you move in this direction, for sure.
And I would say it was like the strategies were wise, and they are also now perpetuating the disconnection, which is why we are not creating more intimacy with the people who can't receive our direct requests and can't, like, in those relationships. And we have these cyclical arguments of not feeling heard or not feeling understood or not feeling all of these things. It's because both people, to a certain degree, and I do believe all dynamics, there's a responsibility of one person, there's a responsibility of the other person. It's never just one person or the other. Like, a dynamic exists with two people engaging in it in a certain degree. Rewiring their own nervous system so that they can actually own and say no. Like, often some of the fear is their own inability to say no to somebody else. So they're going to soften and not want to, they take responsibility for that person not wanting to say no because that feels unsafe for them in saying no. So there's also this like projection. And so they take care of that so they don't ask. And then there's just like all this weird stuff that we do, meddling the domains, looking after them, that actually continues to perpetuate the disconnection. So it is at some point the safer route, but the safer route is no longer serving us to that which we want. And so we have to learn to step outside, push the edges of our feeling of safety, regain safety in vulnerable and open in relationship to the people that we're in relationship with. Often it's working with us so that they can learn how to feel safe in their own bodies, and strategies of how to open the dialogue of, I want to move towards this and I need your help in helping me move towards this, and these things like that, so that they can learn to feel safer in a different strategy.
I would just add to that yes, there are some relationships in which you are, in a sense, sort of stuck, especially if it's a parental relationship and you're younger and there's a power dynamic, or you're in a very long-term relationship with kids and long-term marriage or something where it's not just easy to start to hold your own domain. But in a lot of other relationships, the language we use when we're doing our authentic intimacy course, we use the Wheel of Consent by Betty Martin, is when you're bringing two domains together, you need to communicate what you're available for and what you're interested in and what your limits are, and to make conscious agreements like that. And if we're in a relationship where we're feeling like we need to use these other strategies because it's not safe to ask, we are also communicating that we're available for and interested in this kind of relationship dynamic, just like Kiki is saying. So it reinforces what we're doing. And if you want change to happen, you're going to have to take responsibility for your domain, which can be very scary. And ultimately, part of that is learning to find safety in your own body so that you can step out and say, no, I'm not going to relate this way anymore. Again, I understand that there are some relationships where that's easier said than done.
Love that we can bring it back to the body, being that the whole ethos is soma, relating, of the body. And I think that that really underpins so much of the learning that I've gone through, and that I also encourage clients and listeners to go through, is that when it is that we are confronted with situations and relationships that feel incongruent, that are forcing us out of authenticity, out of truthfulness, into secrecy or passivity in our language, the body's going to signal, right? We feel tense, we feel uneasy, we feel deflated, we feel less powerful, whatever it is. And that is actually both the signpost and the warning sign, and the invitation into a greater degree of accountability, like you're speaking to, Jason, where if we can be so bold as to say that an easeful, regulated nervous system is what we're aiming towards, I don't think that's too bold of a statement to make nowadays, that there are in fact methods of internal awareness and external articulation as it relates to what we want and need that promote that we can actually start to speak better, to ask better, to express better in a way that serves the body. And I think that that is such a powerful revelation. And I love that this is what you guys are bringing forward into the world. We're going to take a short break here, and then we'll come back with the second half of the show. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. All right, we are back now at the second half of the show, which means we are at the section called Question of the Week. This is where I encourage the guest to bring forward a question or inquiry, something that's important, relevant, or interesting to them, or something that they would like to showcase with the audience. So that being said, friends, what do we have for us today?
Well, in light of what we're discussing, a question that I often have around this is, so here's my question to you is, why are we socialized to not ask for what we want, and who does it benefit?
The very first thing that comes to mind is that the socialization is not where it starts. That this propensity to deny one's inner truth is actually an outcropping of a deeper evolutionary adaptation to conform. And so when we're speaking about social groups and we're speaking about social cohesion, the need for belonging is absolutely paramount. And when we go back to less industrial societies where the risk of death if you were on your own was far, far greater, then the cohesion to the group mind was the way by which we survived. Our participation in group myth, our participation in societal expectations, all of those were the main thoroughfares through which we received our wants and needs. And so we have this innate sociability that prioritizes the way that we're received by other people, insofar as it is acceptable to our continued belonging. So that's the base that we're working with. And now that we have started to exist in a more industrial and a more individuated society, this propensity is not as necessary, but still just as strong. And so, on the one hand, why is it that we've been socialized to do this? It worked to keep us alive for some time. And this is a bit akin to what we spoke to just before the break around, in those relationships where we can't be vulnerable and open, sometimes the best strategy is to deny direct communication. And I think that that's true on a macro scale in terms of the socialization. As to who it benefits, that's a really interesting question, because we can look at it at a lot of different angles. Now, if we accept the notion that society is made up of units, and the smallest unit of society is any relationship between two people, then that's where we have to look for the benefit. Who's benefiting when someone is denying their needs? Is it the other person? Because it's certainly not the one who's denying their needs, not in the long run, right? So rather than saying it benefits a person, it benefits a power differential. If one person is willing to continually deny their needs and deny their wants, obviously they're still going to try and get them, but there's more power to the other person insofar as they don't have to be confronted with the vulnerable and empowered expression of the other person. And so when we extrapolate this out, what we're looking at, insofar as I can see it, is a social tolerance for not having our needs met. And that social tolerance benefits those who, we could say, might have structures that reap great rewards from people not seeking their direct expression or the greatest fulfillment of their psychological, physiological, spiritual, and relational needs. Now, I'm not pointing fingers and going, oh, it's the people with the funny hats or, whatever. But that's what immediately comes to mind, is that we have a base physiological compulsion towards it, and that our individuated society that is interwoven with this capitalist mentality is leveraging that denial of need. And I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting take on this. I'm while of course belonging and the threat of group exclusion being a safety issue, evolutionarily speaking, I'm not as sure that that's playing into it today, because it feels also cultural in the sense that I haven't traveled as much as the two of you, from what I understand, but I have been in other places where this is not as limiting. Like, people are more direct. So I think there's a cultural aspect to it as well. I've been wondering if it is connected to this individualized society where we're not coming together as groups, and we're not finding nervous system ease together. So indigenous communities, other communities, there's traditions of coming together where we actually are having practices that bring ease into our bodies and allow us to feel connected. And your point about the importance of belonging, I think if there was strong cohesion in a group or a clan or, say, a tribe, your desires would probably be fairly well aligned with what's going on in that group, and it might be safer, easier to ask for those things. But I wonder, and I'm not a sociologist, so I'm just wondering if we have a sort of epidemic of nervous system dysregulation in the West, especially, post 20th century, where we had a number of generations go through a lot, and we've lost the art of nervous system regulation in community and connection. And so no's feel like a threat. We've lost the tradition, the habit, the safety of asking for something where a no might result. And I wonder if the benefit from this and the way that this keeps perpetuating is we now live in a very consumeristic society, and not being in touch with our desires and communicating them means that we're very susceptible to having those desires be, again, incepted into us. And that serves the consumeristic, capitalistic needs we have today, because we actually need very little. Like, we need some feeling of connection, belonging, and we need very little. But what we do need, we're not even in touch with that. We're not even able to communicate that. So then we're susceptible to what we're told we need.
Which end up being more like wants, but we attribute them to needs. That's a little bit of what I'm hearing you say, and I think I would agree. Yeah, I tend to look at this, and I don't know if this is fully answering kind of the more global question, but just in like families and how we were all raised. Like, there is a societal conditioning. Where it started, I don't know. I'm not a sociologist. I haven't studied any of this. But some of the socializing starts at a young age, where we're just like told that we want or need things different than what our body is telling me we want. You must eat now. You need to eat all your food. You need to, all these things that are then disconnecting us from what our body is telling us. So then the external stimuli overrides the internal stimuli. And we start to create this paradigm where what I'm told I want is more important than what my body is telling me I want. And then we become susceptible, like Jay was just saying, to external telling us you want more consumerism or whatever. And we're going after all these things that aren't actually bringing us connection, joy, belonging, success, happiness, fulfillment, because they're externally motivated stimuli instead of internally motivated stimuli. So we're disconnected from our internal compass or internal body system telling us you want to persevere this, or to pursue this for this means, even though it counters all these other things you've been told you want. And what does it mean to go after that? And what comes when we actually do that? Who it serves, I think at a baseline level, when you're a kid, it serves the family, or it serves the parent, or it serves the person who, as you said a moment ago, Oak, the person in power to the person who has less power. And oftentimes, and I want to be actually intentionally gentle here while still naming what's real, is it's also parents are in survival, trying to get things done, trying to move the family along, trying to all these things, that all these elements get kind of stifled out of children, which then we become this embodied adult who is disconnected from our wants and needs. So I think that's one of the actual just basic reasons why it happens and perpetuates and continues to happen, unless you become a parent who intentionally creates space for your kids to have wants and needs and invite them to learn how to ask for them and all these things. But most of us were not necessarily parented in that way, though I do think there are changes in parenting moving forward. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of name that.
Both of you have touched on the subject from meaningfully informative angles, and I think they're quite complementary. I think, Kiki, what you're speaking to about this external overriding the internal stimulus is emblematic of the epidemic of nervous system regulation that Jason spoke to. And from a sociological perspective, the target that I would aim my arrow at, if we're looking at where we found this disconnection, is twofold. One would be the great expansion of Christianity through Europe, and the second would be the Enlightenment, where we started to operate from the mind-body duality. So in the first instance, the there's now, okay, as someone who studied religion, allow me to just throw this caveat out. There are and have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Christian denominations across the world through time. All have varying degrees and differences in perspective when it comes to this particular topic. But the pervading one, and the one that has made itself most popular across the world, be it Catholicism or Protestantism post-Reformation, has demonized the body, has said that the body is unclean, the nature of the body is to be overcome, to be denied in some aspect, and that the body is essentially not to be trusted. And that proposition means that our seat of humanity, that is then served by our communication in relationships, is denied and misconstrued. And okay, let's extrapolate this out 1500, 2000 years, and you've got societies that are now not heart focused, not even gut focused, but focused in this mental realm of separation that is continually propagating this goal-oriented, individuated mentality. Now, let me bring that down to something a bit more concise. When we're talking about that community enmeshment, that's what gets lost when we disconnect from the body. Because if we disconnect from our body, we have necessarily disconnected from the body of the group and the body of Earth. And why this is important in terms of needs and the perpetuation of the denial of needs, as Jason, you put so aptly, is that when we are inside of a community that values who and what we are, a community that we belong to, then our needs are no longer individual needs. They are now the community's needs. And it's not that it's, these are our needs, comrade. I'm not talking on a communist kind of perspective. It's a recognition of the symbiotic and interdependent relationship that blooms when we gather in this way. And if you find yourself, and you have the blessing to find yourself ensconced in a community where its members see your needs as valid and equally worthy of being met to their own, then the pathway to vulnerable and open expression widens. Look at that.
Mm-hmm.
I've got 6 people looking at me saying, yeah, how are you feeling today? What's it like to be you? Is there anything that we can do to support you? It's like, oh my God, I'll tell you. Yeah, I'll tell you. Sure. Here we go. Because that no would be so antithetical to the health of everybody there that the barrier to entry for acknowledging needs, acknowledging the body, and receiving vulnerability drops precipitously. It's a very, very powerful perspective. I appreciate you both for bringing that forward.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you articulated that. And I just want to speak from some experience here now. I experienced that since joining a men's circle a couple of years ago, where each other's the needs of the individual in a sense become the needs of the group. And there's some growth and there's evolution from each man that's a part of that. But we all eventually learn to share and be more open about what's real for us and what we need. And I can tell you that I've had some incredible, immense needs met from this small group of 10 men in ways that I could never have imagined. But we are separate domains. I was able to share what I need. And some of those needs, I didn't even know those needs were meetable in a sense. And they would step forward into that space and communicate how they could be available to help me. And that was because I was in this cohesive group where I belong.
I'm so glad you've had that experience, Jay. I feel a warmth in my heart in receiving that story. Thank you for sharing. Would you be willing to name the men's group?
Yeah, I'm a part of the Arca Brotherhood, which has groups all around North America and online. So I'm in a group here in the lower mainland of Vancouver, and we meet once a week. And some really good work takes place in there just in learning to be vulnerable and open. And even in that space, sometimes, especially with people who are newer, you can see some of these strategies be employed. And as a group, then we can hold some accountability, and whether it's in their relationships with other people or even with the relationships with the group, we can call that out and go, no, no, like, what do you want? What do you want? Okay, make that statement here. Great.
Brilliant. Kiki, you were going to say?
Yeah, as I was just like listening to the both of you talk about it, one of the kind of, I guess, answers to rectifying this disconnection we have from our own wants and needs and inability to like name them forward is actually coming back to a sense of belonging in general, belonging with ourself in our own body and belonging with us in relationship to the world around us. And I know a lot of the work that Jay and I do is actually welcoming and opening space. And I've talked about this before, for all parts of ourselves to belong and have a space to be brought forward in a coaching session. Is one of the first places where a lot of people coaching and or therapy, where a lot of people can experience that kind of deeper sense of all of themselves being available online to belong, so that they can actually bring it forward in other parts of their life. But just listening to it, like, just hit me. I don't often use the word belonging as often, but that it is really this deeper need of us to belong to ourselves, to the world, to the community, to everything that precipitates our ability to be vulnerable and open, to step out into the world and honor and own what we want and need.
Mm-hmm. It's a positive feedback loop. This is what I found with vulnerability and authenticity. And what I mean by that is that when you're willing to take that first little risk to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to be open, to name what's real, even if it's just a feeling and not an ask, when you do this consistently, the people who value vulnerability, who are safe to be vulnerable with, who are open, who are interested, they stick around. And the ones who would prefer you to shut up or smuggle or justify your behavior or what have you, they start to feel the dissonance between what you're living as, your true being coming forward, and what's actually going on with them. They create a little bit of distance. This is actually an experiment I did when I moved to Australia. Because of the anonymity, I thought, I am going to just be 100% myself as I feel every single day, because nobody knows me. And the idea was that if I do this, the people who come around and that I meet are going to really be my friends. They're going to be online with what feels true and the values that I bring. And no word of a lie, I met some of the most beautiful, resonant, loving, generous people through this experiment. You know, did I also get rejected? For sure. Did I get ridiculed sometimes? Absolutely. But I would absolutely endure those uncomfortable moments, knowing that I came out of it with lifelong friends. And I think that that's really the point of encouragement I want to offer through that story, is that there's a great benefit to your relationships and to your own emotional well-being by taking that risk.
Well, as Brene Brown has said numerous times, when we conform to be in a group, but more of ourself is offline in that conforming experience, so we're not actually being authentically ourselves, we will not feel a sense of belonging. So while we are welcomed in the group in that fractionated version of ourself, we might feel like we have friends and we have all these things. We're actually rejecting ourself, which doesn't create a feeling of belonging. And it's only in actually being who we are in the world and having that full version of ourselves being welcomed and met by people that we can experience a sense of belonging. Vulnerability is the key to all of it.
Yeah, right. Because if you're not being authentic, what are they there to accept? That makes sense. Sorry, Jay, please.
No, and you're absolutely right. And I just wanted to add this piece that finding your authentic self can be a journey. It's one thing to say, I'm going to show up authentically. It's another to know what that is, especially when we're socialized to not be in touch with our desires and be able to communicate that. So there might be some experimentation and trial and error to figure out what that even is. So I also just wanted to extend some compassion as you try to figure out, what is my authentic self? What do I actually want? And you may try things on and realize that wasn't me. And that's okay. That's part of the process.
And a thing in that is often I was in this delusion in my like 20s at some point that being my authentic self meant that I was the same. I'm only being my authentic self if I'm the same with every person that I meet, because then that's me being me. But there is also, who am I with this person and who am I with this person? I feel safer with this person. They get more access to all of me. I feel a little less safe here. They're not necessarily going to get all of me because all of me is not safe here. And that doesn't mean I'm not being authentically attuned to myself and the relationship, but different parts of me are welcome and authentically being expressed in the different dynamics that present themselves in the world. And having that maturity and learning that was really helpful in me not kind of bulldozing certain situations by being my full authentic self in every situation that wasn't necessarily the right time for that perhaps version of me. So I think also under knowing that and being gentle with ourselves around that can also be helpful. It was for me.
Yeah, authenticity is a present moment practice. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a regurgitation of a set of states or preferences or actions. The greatest well of authenticity is discovered when we are open and curious to uncovering and relating with whatever it is that is real in the present, in this moment. And sometimes authenticity, even with the same person on different days, looks different. And I think that that's the really powerful piece, is that we resonate with what is real because we value what is real and we value what is true. And I can say that I have valued all of each of you that you have brought today, and all of the insights and beautiful conversation, and this dynamic has been so deeply enriching. So I thank you both for your time. And for those of the audience who are curious or maybe confronted by their own communication and are looking to develop into greater authenticity, what have you got going on, and where can they find you?
They can find us at somarelating.ca, and the quiz is there if they want to take the quiz. If your listeners enjoyed this material and want to do a deeper dive, we offer an online course called Authentic Intimacy, and we unpack all of these ideas and walk through how to make conscious agreements. Normally it's $59, but we're offering a coupon for your listeners for 15% off. They just use the coupon code SMILE15, and you can get reduced rate on that. But in that course, we walk through domains. We walk through how to kind of uncouple those domains and get out of codependency, create separate domains so that you can then make conscious agreements and come together in more authentic ways.
Brilliant. All of those links will, of course, be in the description for the episode, as well as the video description on YouTube. But be sure to make it easy for anyone who's interested to find what you do. And from my own personal perspective, having gone through the quiz and knowing you both and your work, it is well worth having a look and diving in. Jay, Kiki, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for being a part of the Smiling Human.
Thanks for having us.
And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.